Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this expressive Highland cow using watercolors step by step, and I'm also going to give you some tips for using watercolor along the way as well. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. So this guy was actually quite an older painting and I realized I didn't actually do a tutorial using it. So this one isn't going to be a real-time video on Patreon because I only have some real-time footage for this piece, but I do have other watercolor tutorials on Patreon if you're interested. There's a link in the description if you want to check out what is available on Patreon. For this piece, I'm working on Fabriano Artistico hot pressed watercolor paper, and you can use any brand of watercolor paper that you have, but I'd recommend getting 100% cotton, and you can use hot pressed or cold pressed. So the main difference between the hot pressed and the cold pressed is that the hot pressed is a bit smoother and it sort of dries a little bit faster than the cold pressed. And the cold pressed paper is really great for expressive pieces like this as well. I just sometimes use the hot pressed because I like that smooth look, but yeah, whichever paper you prefer, use that. So usually I'd recommend taping your work down so that when your paper is drying, it dries flat into place again, but this paper doesn't actually need to be taped down because it's in a block, which means that it's glued around all of the edges, so it will stay in place and dry flat anyway. But I have got some washi tape taped around my piece just to create a nice clean border once I'm finished. And for this piece I'm actually using Van Gogh watercolors, which are actually student grade, but I really like them. I'm no expert with watercolors, but I know that the colors that I've chosen for my palette are light fast and pretty good quality actually. And these watercolors are actually made by Royal Talons, who make other brands like Rembrandt and Sakura. So yeah, if you're looking for some cheaper watercolors, then I definitely recommend looking into these as an option. So I've just started by applying water to the entire background, and I made sure not to go over the Highland cow itself because I don't want the paint that I'm applying on the background to spread onto the Highland cow. And then I've just gone through and added some blues and teals and yellows. And this is called the wet on wet technique. So I'm basically applying wet paint to a wet background. And this will mean that the paint will bleed out nice and softly and mix into the colors that are next to it, so there won't be any harsh lines this way. So here I'm just adding a variety of splatters. So to make the splatters, all I'm doing is adding a little more water to the paint and then tapping the back of the paintbrush to create these splatter effects on my paper. And if you want to create bigger splatters, you can use a bigger paintbrush. If you want to create smaller splatters, use a smaller paintbrush. So when you do the splatter technique on a wet background, it's like the wet on wet technique where the colors will fade out and sort of blur around the edges. So if you want to create a crisper line or a crisp splatter effect where the edges of the splatter are really prominent, and then you want to make sure that your paper is dry before you do the splatter technique. And I'm also adding a little bit of table salt to some of the background, and what that will do is create this sort of nice starry sort of effect once it dries because it soaks up some of that paint and just creates a nice effect. I like to include this in some of my watercolor paintings as well. Okay, so I don't have the footage for it, but I actually applied masking fluid to the nose area and the horns so that when I'm working on the body, I don't get any paint on those areas, so they stay nice and clean. Okay, so starting on the Highland cow itself, I'm just mixing up a few different colored browns and sort of light browns and dark browns, and I'm applying those to the body. And I haven't wet all of the cow, I've only wet the areas that I'm going to be working on, because if you wet areas next to the area that you're going to be working on, that color will bleed into that area. So I've left some of the face dry, and also that horn that's on the right hand side, I've left that dry as well while I work on the body. So I'm just building up different colors, some browns, some yellows, a little bit of purple and some reds in there as well to give it a little bit of variation. And I've also wet a little bit of the background around the cow so that when I add some color to the cow, it will spread out a little bit into the background just to create a bit more of an expressive effect. So when you're using the wet on wet technique, if you find that your paper is drying before you're done working on that area, I would suggest to let your paper completely dry. Don't try and work on it while it's slightly damp or starting to dry, because the paint will end up creating sort of like harsh lines, sort of like the top left hand corner there. But for me, mine's an expressive piece and I actually wanted that look in that corner, so I left it like that. But if you didn't want to have those lines that are on the outside of that area, and then let your paper completely dry, and then once your paper is completely dry, just wet that entire area and come back through and keep working on it. And then once I've done that base layer, I'm just going to come through and dry it with a hairdryer. So just make sure that you've got it on quite a low setting and not too close to the paper paper. And then I'm just coming through and adding a base layer to the horns, and I'm just building up the colors. So I started out with sort of like a grey blue color as the base layer, and then I've taken a darker color to create a shadow underneath the horns, so that way those two colors will sort of bleed out into each other and create a nice transition between the light areas and the dark areas. And then moving on to the nose area, I'm just starting with the darkest areas first. So I'm just making sure that I'm using a lot of blues and purples in the really dark areas, because you want to make sure that you're not just using black in any area. So even when you're working on shadows that are super dark, a lot of people say that you shouldn't use black in your artwork at all, but I like to use black. I just mix it in with other colors so that it's not just black by itself, because sometimes when you have black by itself, it can look quite flat, whereas if you add other colors in with it, like the blues and the purples, it creates a much more sort of vibrant, rich, darker color rather than just using black, so it keeps it from looking flat. Then I'll just come back through and layer more colors over the top of that once it's dry as well. Before I show you the next step, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolor, and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So I'm just coming back over the entire cow and adding in more different coloured browns and reds and going over the top of any of the shadow areas that I did as well, just to make it a bit more cohesive. So the shadow around the mouth area, I've gone over the top of that with some browns as well. And I'm just going for an expressive style with this one. So I'm not too worried about having the fur strokes exactly perfect. I'm just sort of getting the general gist of the fur. And I'm adding in some more splatters as well. And the paper in the background is dry, obviously, so this will create some more harsher splatters. So throughout my piece, I like to vary up whether I do the wet on wet technique or the wet on dry technique with the splatters, because I think it makes a nice variety of different kinds of splatters as well. So I'm just adding a little bit more depth to the background, adding in some of those reds and browns in the background as well, just to make it look a little bit more cohesive with the cow. So now I'm coming back through and adding in some richer sort of purples and reds in a lot of the shadow areas, because I find that when you work with orange or yellowy sort of subjects, if you use magenta or purple in the shadow areas, it really creates a nice shadow color without using like a dark brown or a black. I think the magenta looks really nice in combination with those more orange tones. So when I work with watercolors, it's basically just a layering process. So I'm just building up my layers and adding more and more color to each layer as I go along. So right here, I'm adding a little bit more watercolor to certain areas, and I'm tipping my artwork up so that the drips fall down from those areas, just to create a nice different sort of effect there. So I like to create all sorts of different effects when I'm working on expressive pieces, just because I find it quite fun to work this way in comparison to a lot of my other more realistic choices when I use pastels and coloured pencils and things like that. I like to be a bit more expressive with the watercolour and just have fun with the paint and kind of let it do what it wants to do. So when I'm working with watercolour, one of the things that I learned quite early on, which was really helpful, was to use 2 jars of water. And I know that might sound basic to some of you who've worked with watercolour before, but when I first started, I was just using 1 jar of water, and I would clean my brush in that water and then go into my next color of paint, and it would just muddy up that color. Whereas if you use 2 jars of water, you can wash off your paintbrush in 1 jar, which is the allocated dirty jar, and then you just rinse off the brush in the clean jar. So the dirty jar will take off most of the excess paint, and then you'll just use the clean jar when you want to add water to things, or if you want to do your final rinse from your brush. So that way your brush stays really clean, and also you have a clean jar of water, so you don't have to keep changing the jars of water all the time. So you just want to remember that with watercolor, it always dries a little bit lighter than what it looked like when it was wet. So I always go a little bit darker and a little bit more vibrant than what I want my end result to be, knowing that it's going to dry a little bit lighter. But the good thing about watercolor is that you can also layer more colors on top. So if it does dry a little bit lighter, you can go back through and add in more colors on top. And although this is not a very detailed piece, I'm still making sure that my brush strokes are going in the right direction. So I'm making sure that any strokes that I'm adding are going in the same direction as the fur of the cow, because you don't want to go in sort of a horizontal direction because it will make the fur look like it's going horizontally. It will look a little bit odd. So you want to make sure that your brush strokes are still going in the right direction and generally the right length as well. So in areas where there's shorter fur, you don't want to do really super long strokes there because it will make it look like the hair is long in that area. And same on the body, the fur is quite long, but if you do really short strokes in that area, it's going to look like it has short fur there. So you want to make sure that you're following the general direction and also the general length of the fur in that area. I know I talk about my values quite a lot in my realistic pieces, making sure that your darks are dark enough and your highlights are light enough, but it still applies to expressive pieces like this. Even though the shadow areas and the highlight areas might not be super defined, you still want to make sure that you have those shadows and highlights in the right area and that they are as dark as they need to be and as light as they need to be. So even though this is an expressive piece and it's in watercolor, which is usually a lighter medium to work with, I still like to have my darks quite dark and my lights quite light, just to give that contrast in the piece, because I still think it looks really nice to have those dark and the light areas, even if it is an expressive piece. It just really makes the artwork pop. So here I'm actually adding some white gouache to some of the areas, and in the areas where I want it to be a bit more opaque, like a really bright sort of highlight, I'm not watering down the gouache too much. I'm using it not straight from the tube, but just with a little bit of water. When you add more water to the gouache, it becomes a little more translucent and kind of like a cloudy effect. But when you use gouache with watercolor, you can actually mix the two mediums. So if you want to create a more opaque version of one of your watercolors, you can mix the gouache in with the watercolor and it will create a more opaque color. The only problem with that is that it kind of makes like a more pastel color. It sort of dulls it down and gives it sort of like a milky effect. So another way you can get a more vibrant color is to use the gouache first and then let it dry and then go over the top of that with watercolor. So you can actually mix the two mediums. There's no problems there with any archival issues or anything like that. A lot of watercolor purists don't particularly like using gouache because they feel like it's cheating, but I don't know, I really like the effect and I'm just here to have fun with artwork. I'm not trying to create a really traditional piece of art that follows all of the so-called rules to watercolor. So to me, as long as it's archival, I don't really mind what kind of supplies or techniques I'm using if I like the look of it in the end. So I like to use things like gouache in my watercolor pieces because I think it can create a really nice effect in some artworks. So I'm just adding some more splatters, especially with the white gouache on the background, because I find that the white splatters can look really quite nice. So I'm adding in a few different colors here and there as well, like the purples and yellows, just to make it a little bit more colorful. And then I've gone and taken the washi tape off the outside without actually doing that little bit of grass that he's eating. The shape of his mouth is in a weird location if I didn't include that piece of grass, because he's actually eating, so his jaw is moved a little bit to the side. So it doesn't make a lot of sense if I don't include that. So I've gone back and added that in just with a little bit of white gouache mixed with sort of a browny green color. And then I just applied that with a really thin brush. There's a playlist on the screen with some other watercolor and gouache tutorials that I thought you might enjoy, so click on that and I'll see you over there.